tune.
My name is Callum Whitford. I'm 52 years old and I write music for films. Not the massive franchise stuff where the orchestra swells every time someone in a cape punches another caped person, though I've had offers. I mean the quieter, stranger films. Independent productions, character studies, period pieces that take 4 years to get funding, and then screen at festivals where the popcorn is overpriced, and the audience actually talks to you afterward about what the score made them feel. For most of my career, those were the films I lived for. They weren't making me rich, but they were making me feel alive in a way I couldn't explain to people who didn't already get it. The problem, it turned out, was that my ex-wife didn't get it. Or maybe she did get it, and that was the problem. She understood exactly what kind of life I was building, and she decided she wanted a different one. Her name is Renata. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's party in Brooklyn. She was sharp, funny, and driven in a way that felt exciting back then. She worked in financial consulting and had plans for herself that extended 20 years into the future, structured and mapped like a project proposal. I admired that about her. I thought we complemented each other. Her precision, my spontaneity, her spreadsheets, my sheet music. For a few years, we made it work. We got married when we were both 31. Our daughter Opal came along 2 years later. The cracks started showing slowly, the way they usually do. Renata got promoted, then promoted again. She moved into restructuring struggling firms, developed a reputation, and started bringing home a salary that made my income look like a rounding error. Meanwhile, I was scoring documentaries about things like wetland conservation and the history of labor unions. Meaningful to me, financially modest, and apparently awkward to explain at dinner parties. I still remember the morning she told me she was done. It was 2008. The economy was in freefall. I was in the middle of writing a score for a climate documentary, sitting at my upright piano in our apartment when Renata came into the room, arms folded, and stood in the doorway like she'd rehearsed what she was about to say. "This isn't sustainable, Callum," she said. Not angry, just measured, conclusive. "We have Opal. We have a mortgage. I need a partner who's building toward something real." "I am building something," I said. "A composition for a documentary that 12,000 people will watch once on a streaming platform is not building something." She said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "I'm not saying your music doesn't matter. I'm saying it can't be our entire financial strategy." I told her my music paid its share. She pointed out correctly that her job paid 3 times what mine did, and that Opal's college fund was essentially just Renata's college fund, and that retirement was a concept I seemed to be treating as optional. We argued for about an hour. Then, we didn't. She'd already made up her mind. The divorce was civil, as these things go. Renata kept the apartment. I moved into a smaller place in a different part of Brooklyn. And I brought my work and my piano with me. We split custody of Opal, who was 9 at the time, and old enough to understand that something had broken, but not old enough to understand why. I paid child support without missing a payment. I showed up to every recital, every school play, every parent-teacher conference I wasn't specifically asked to skip. Renata kept climbing. By the time Opal was in high school, Renata had become CFO at Carver Meridian Bank, one of the larger regional institutions that had survived the 2008 collapse by making cautious, intelligent decisions. Decisions Renata had helped architect. She was genuinely good at her job. I never disputed that. And I kept composing. The years between the divorce and the wedding were not glamorous. There were stretches where I was genuinely worried. Projects fell through. Funding dried up. I took on a few commercial projects I'm not proud of. Jingle work, corporate video scores, stuff I don't put on my bio. But I kept writing the music I cared about whenever I could. I kept sending work out. I kept saying yes to small films that couldn't pay much, but that had something true in them. Then came the film that changed everything. It was called Foxglove and Rust, a small independent film set in 1970s Detroit, following 3 generations of a black family navigating the collapse of the auto industry. The director, a woman named Priya Agarwal, who'd been trying to get the film made for 7 years, found me through a mutual contact and asked if I'd score it. The budget was almost nothing. I took the project anyway because the script made me cry on the first read-through, and that had never happened before. I poured everything into that score. Every doubt I'd ever had. Every quiet morning in my apartment wondering if Renata had been right. Every moment of watching Opal grow up while only half present because I was always inside my own head, listening to something no one else could hear yet. I wrote music that felt like grief and also like defiance. And when the film was finished, something clicked into place that I can't fully describe even now. The film went to Sundance, then to other festivals. Critics noticed the score specifically, which almost never happens. When the Oscar nominations came out and my name was on the list, I sat alone in my studio for 20 minutes before I told anyone. When I won, my phone didn't stop ringing for 4 days. Suddenly, the calls weren't just from indie directors. Studios called. Networks called. A production company offered me a 3-picture deal. My financial situation transformed in a way that felt slightly surreal. I had to hire an actual accountant, which was not a sentence I'd ever expected to say. I invested cautiously, built the production company, took on a few larger projects while protecting time for the smaller ones that still fed me creatively. I never called Renata to tell her. I'm not sure why. Some combination of not needing her to know and not wanting the conversation that would follow. I kept my money at Carver Meridian Bank partly out of inertia, partly out of some lingering sense of, I don't know, connection, maybe. It was a mistake in retrospect, but not one I thought much about until the night of the wedding. Renata had been with Broderick Hale for about 2 years before they got engaged. I knew about him through Opal, who had not warmed to him despite his attempts to win her over with expensive concert tickets and mentions of his friends in high places. Broderick was a venture capitalist, which in New York in those years meant he was either brilliant or lucky or both, and he seemed to have decided somewhere along the way that the difference didn't matter. He was also apparently running for a congressional seat, which explains some of the performance quality of his personality whenever he was in public. When the wedding invitation arrived, I held it for a long time before I decided anything. On one hand, attending your ex-wife's wedding is an objectively strange choice. On the other hand, Opal was a bridesmaid, and Renata's brother Fitz had called me personally to say he hoped I'd come. Fitz and I had stayed close after the divorce in the way that sometimes happens. He'd always been more supportive of my music than his sister, had shown up to small venue performances in my lean years when the audience was 14 people and a bartender who was only half paying attention. I RSVP'd yes. I told myself it was for Opal and Fitz. Maybe that was even mostly true. I remember sitting in a taxi on the way to the venue, looking out at the city sliding past and just thinking. That reflective, slightly melancholy state that happens when you're on your way to an event you're not sure you should be attending. The traffic was slow. The driver had some talk radio on at low volume. I was watching the people on the sidewalks and thinking, as I sometimes did on quiet evenings, about the marriage. Not with bitterness anymore, that had burned off years ago, but with the kind of careful curiosity you apply to something you want to understand clearly. Then the guy in the seat next to me at the next light, actually, we were stopped, and I had the window cracked, started talking loudly on his phone. He was maybe mid-30s, sitting on a bench outside a cafe we were idling beside, and he was in the middle of what sounded like a very enthusiastic recap of a recent date. "No, listen to me," he was saying, laughing. "The app actually works. I'm serious. Single tune. You take this compatibility test, right? And it's not the usual garbage questions about your hobbies. It asks you stuff about values like, what do you prioritize? Experience or accumulation? Art or status? And then it finds you people who've answered the same way." I caught myself listening. "He's an illustrator," the guy continued, voice bright with that particular happiness that comes from something new that you're not used to having. He said the test made him feel like the app already knew him before he'd said a word. And we talked for 4 hours on the first date. 4 hours. When's the last time that happened to you? Single tune, I thought. Is that like tuning for singles? Some kind of frequency thing? I almost laughed at myself for the mental image. A radio dial, people being calibrated to the right station. But then something quieter followed the joke, the way it sometimes does when you're in a reflective mood and your guard is slightly down. If something like that had existed 20 years ago, not just a dating app, but one that actually asked the right questions. Not where do you like to vacation, but what do you believe is worth giving your life to? Would Renata and I have ever matched? Would the algorithm have seen what neither of us had been honest enough to say out loud before we'd signed the marriage license? That we valued fundamentally different things and were hoping the other person would eventually come around? I watched the guy on the bench wrap up his call, still smiling. The smile of someone who'd recently found out a thing they needed to know about themselves, and then found someone who confirmed it. There was something quietly hopeful about it. The taxi moved again. The guy disappeared behind us. Single tune. Authentic vibes only. Filter out the noise. Maybe that was the actual thing Renata and I had never managed to do. Filter out the noise of what we thought we were supposed to want long enough to hear what we actually needed. I pressed my face slightly toward the glass and let the thought pass through me without gripping it. The venue was on a rooftop in Midtown, one of those places that requires connections just to know it exists, let alone book it. I stepped out of the elevator into what looked like a magazine spread that had achieved sentience and started hosting events. Crystal everything, white flowers everywhere, servers materializing at your elbow with champagne before you'd consciously decided you wanted any. Dad! Opal appeared at my side almost immediately. She was 19 and in a bridesmaid's dress the color of warm cream, and she looked so much like Renata that it occasionally still caught me off guard, except for her eyes, which are mine. She has my restless, searching eyes. You actually showed up. I said I would. I know, but I wasn't entirely sure. I kissed her on the cheek. How's your mother? Controlling every single variable of this event and somehow still finding things that aren't right. She said it without malice, just the familiar, resigned affection of someone who has cataloged a parent's specific form of anxiety for years. She's been here since 6 this morning. And the groom? Opal's expression shifted in a way she didn't quite manage to conceal. Broderick's somewhere telling people about his polling numbers. You'll meet him. There was something in the way she said it that I filed away without comment. Fitz found me a few minutes later, moving through the crowd with his easy confidence. He'd done well in tech, and it showed. Not in a showy way, but in the relaxed posture of someone who no longer has to worry about certain categories of problems. You came, he said, embracing me. You asked me to. I did. He handed me a fresh glass of sparkling beverage. Fair warning. Broderick's been asking about you. Asking what? Who invited you? Whether it would be, and I'm quoting, awkward. Fitz made the kind of face that said the word was a stand-in for something less polite. He has a certain image of you. Let me guess. He thinks you're a piano teacher who couldn't hold a stable job. Fitz watched my face for a reaction. Renata never really updated the file on you, if you know what I mean. She's told people you're a musician, but not. He gestured in a way that took in, I suppose, the Oscar, the production company, the penthouse I'd moved into after my financial situation had changed so completely that I'd had to actively recalibrate my sense of what was normal. She never told him, I said. She never told anyone here. Fitz shook his head. I think she needed a version of you that made sense of her choices. I turned that over. That's either very understandable or very strange. Both, Fitz said. Usually is. He nodded toward the approaching couple before I saw them. Renata on Broderick's arm, both of them working the room with the practiced ease of people who consider social performance a form of labor to be optimized. Renata looked extraordinary. That part was just true. She wore success the way some people wear expensive clothes, like it fit because it was made for her. She'd always had that quality. I'd admired it even when it was aimed at things I didn't value. Our eyes met for a moment. Something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, or the particular discomfort of encountering a revised version of a story you've told yourself for years. Then the professional warmth clicked back into place. Callum, she said, perfectly neutral. Renata. I nodded. Beautiful setting. Broderick was already extending his hand with the warm assertiveness of someone who's been taught that a firm handshake establishes dominance before a word is spoken. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of conventionally striking that photographs well. So you're the ex, he said, pleasantly enough. Renata mentioned you teach music. There it was, deployed casually like it was just information. Not exactly, I said. Renata made a small movement beside him, a barely perceptible tension at the shoulder that I recognized from our marriage. Callum writes film scores, she said, offering just enough of the truth to seem accurate while leaving out everything that mattered. Film scores. Broderick nodded with the convincing imitation of interest that politicians perfect. So what, background music for movies? Any I'd know? Opal had appeared beside me in the way she sometimes did when she sensed I needed backup, or possibly just because she wanted to watch what happened next. Dad's latest project is the Paramount Historical Drama Series, she said. Before that, he won an Academy Award for Foxglove and Rust. The pause that followed was brief but complete. An Oscar, Broderick said. Best original score, Opal said pleasantly. Well, Broderick's smile remained but lost some structural integrity. That's unexpected. Life tends to be, I said. Renata's hand found Broderick's arm, the guidance gesture I knew from before, the one that meant redirect before this becomes something. We should greet our other guests. Emily, Bull, will you show your father to his table? As they moved away, Opal leaned close to me. Larry's been telling everyone you gave up and became a piano tutor. So I gathered. I've been waiting for this moment for literally 2 years, she said. And she sounded genuinely satisfied in a way that was pure me, not Renata, at all. The ceremony happened as the sun went down behind the skyline. It was genuinely beautiful, in the staged, deliberate way of events that have been planned by someone who treats beauty as a logistical problem to be solved. Renata walked the aisle, looking certain of herself, which had always been one of her most attractive qualities and also one of the most exhausting to live with. I sat and watched and felt what I felt, which was mostly a kind of distant tenderness. We had loved each other once. That part had been real. We'd just been pointed in different directions and hadn't figured it out until after we'd made a life together that took years to unwind. When they said their vows, I thought about how sure Renata looked. How sure she'd always looked, even when she was wrong. I thought about 2008 and the doorway and the folded arms. I thought about the taxi that morning and the guy on the phone talking about Singleton, and the way his face had looked when he described 4 hours of genuine conversation. I wondered, not for the first time, whether Renata had ever had that, whether Broderick was capable of offering it, or whether she'd chosen again for security and called it love. That wasn't a kind thought, so I let it go. The reception was the usual architecture of these events. Tables of people who mostly knew each other from contexts where the point was being seen, catering designed to impress, a band covering jazz standards with professional competence. I stayed at the table Fitz and I had been assigned, slightly removed from the inner circle, but not quite exiled. We drank and talked and watched the room. She never told a soul, Fitz said at one point, watching Broderick hold court at the bar. About your Oscar, your company, none of it. He genuinely thinks you're a marginal figure. I know. This is going to be a memorable evening. It doesn't have to be. Fitz raised an eyebrow. You don't want to enjoy this a little? I came for Opal, I said, which was mostly true by that point. The dancing started. Opal pulled me onto the floor for one song, and we swayed to a jazz standard that I recognized immediately. I'd rearranged a version of it for a film score 2 years earlier, which felt like the universe being quietly ironic. Broderick told Mom it's ridiculous that I'd intern at your studio, Opal said while we danced. He wants me in Washington for his campaign. What does your mother say? She said it's my choice. Then it is. He's been making speeches about it, about how following you into the arts is throwing away my future prospects. She paused. He called music a supplementary career path. I kept my expression even. He's entitled to his opinion. He's entitled to a lot of opinions he shares loudly, Opal said. As the song ended, Broderick appeared. Politician's smile, cold eyes. Mind if I borrow Opal? Senator Creighton wants to discuss his summer program. He barely looked at me when he said it. She should be building the right connections. It's Opal's choice, I said. Broderick turned the smile directly on me then, and there was something very deliberate behind it. He'd been building towards something since we'd met, and this was apparently the moment he'd chosen. You know, Morris, he said, dropping the warmth from his voice, like a coat he'd decided he didn't need. I don't know what the polite version of this is, so I'll just say it. Your presence here is strange. You're her ex-husband. She's moved on. You should have too. He glanced around to see who was paying attention. Several people nearby had adjusted their posture to better receive whatever was coming. A man who puts his creative ego above his family's security, who lets his ex-wife carry the financial weight for years while he chases awards, that's not a narrative worth celebrating. Whatever you've achieved, you weren't there when it mattered. The area around us had gone quiet. Opal's face had gone very still. I recognized the expression. She was deciding whether to respond and what form the response would take. I spoke first, keeping my voice conversational. I want to make sure I understand you, I said. You want me to step back from my daughter's life and remove myself from Renata's social sphere? Essentially, yes. Okay. I nodded slowly, like I was considering it. The problem is, I keep a significant amount of money at Carver Meridian Bank, about $500 million, and your wife is the CFO. I paused. Given what you've just said about your feelings toward me, I think the responsible thing would be to move my account. On Monday, I'll start the transfer process. Broderick's face did something I don't have an exact word for. It went through 3 distinct phases very rapidly: confusion, disbelief, and then a slow dawning that was visible even from inside his politician's posture. "I'm sorry," he said. "How much?" "500 million, I repeated pleasantly, give or take. My financial advisors have been suggesting I diversify for a while. I kept it there for personal reasons that don't really apply anymore, based on what you've told me tonight." The silence around us was complete. Somewhere behind Broderick, I could see the bank's executive team, several of whom had been invited as guests, processing what they'd just overheard. One of them had gone pale. Another was already moving toward his phone. Renata had appeared at the edge of the small crowd that had formed. She was very still. Broderick tried to recover. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I said. "You were very clear. I appreciated the directness, actually." Opal made a small sound beside me that she immediately suppressed. Renata stepped forward and touched Broderick's arm. "Why don't we give Senator Creighton's table a moment?" she said, her voice carrying that professional steadiness that I'd always genuinely admired. It was the voice she used when the worst thing in the room had just happened, and someone needed to begin managing it. Broderick let himself be steered. The crowd around us dissolved back into the reception. The band, sensing something, began playing again. Conversations resumed with the particular energy of people who have just witnessed something they'll be telling people about later and are now pretending they weren't watching. Fitz materialized at my shoulder. "The bank president looks like someone just lit his car on fire," he murmured. "I'll be speaking with their client services team Monday morning," I said. "Of course you will." Fitz was struggling to maintain a neutral expression and not fully succeeding. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You're better than fine. You just casually mentioned $500 million at a wedding reception." "He asked me to leave." "I know." Fitz raised his glass. "And now his wife is the CFO of the bank about to lose its largest depositor. On her wedding night." When I put it that way, it sounded worse. "I wasn't trying to punish Renata." "I know that too," Fitz said. "But Broderick didn't know who you were. He built this whole mental model of you as the failed also-ran. And he said the quiet part loud in front of 60 people because he thought he could." "People do that," I said, "when they're sure they're right." I set down my glass and headed for the elevator. I'd said what needed to be said, or rather, it had said itself, which sometimes is how things go. Renata caught me in the hallway before the elevator arrived. She was alone, her composure intact, but costing her something. I could see that. "Daniel," she started, then corrected herself. "Callum, please." "Renata, was that necessary?" I considered the question seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "He told me to cut contact with you and Opal, in public, in front of guests." "No, I didn't plan what I said, but I also don't regret it." She pressed her lips together, looked away. "He didn't know." "That's the part I keep coming back to," I said. "He didn't know because you never told him. You kept composing your own version of our marriage, where you left the struggling musician because you had to, because there was no other option. And you couldn't update that version without questioning the whole story." She didn't deny it. That surprised me slightly. "The piano," she said after a moment. "The baby grand from your apartment in Brooklyn. After we separated, you were going to sell it. I asked if I could keep it." "I remember. It's in my study." Her voice was quieter now. "I've listened to your soundtracks. The ones that sound unmistakably like you. The way you use silence. The way your themes come back differently the second time. I always know before I see your name." This was more than she'd said to me in years that wasn't mediated by Opal or logistics. "Why didn't you ever say?" I asked. "Because saying it would have meant admitting I'd been wrong. Not about leaving. We were wrong for each other, Callum, and I think we both know that, but about what I thought your life would become." She met my eyes. "It was easier to believe you'd failed." "Easier than what?" "Than accepting that you chose something I didn't understand, and it turned out to be enough. More than enough." She exhaled. I told myself every year that the stability I chose was worth it, that I'd made the right call. And every time your name appeared in the credits of something beautiful, I had to work a little harder to believe that. From inside the reception, we could hear raised voices, Broderick's and someone from the bank's executive team. "He'll manage," I said. "He's going to be very angry with me," she said. Matter of fact, not afraid. Which told me something about the marriage. Are you okay? She looked at me like the question was unexpected. "I'm fine. I'm the CFO." A small, dry smile. "I've handled worse than an angry venture capitalist on a Monday morning." "The account," I said. "I meant what I said about transferring most of it. But I'll leave enough that it doesn't look like a vendetta. Because it isn't. None of this is about punishing you." Something loosened slightly in her posture. "Thank you. I'd rather we were, I don't know what word to use, functional. For Opal's sake, we have been." She paused. "You never said a single negative thing about me to her. In all those years. She's your daughter, too. Most divorced fathers don't hold to that. Not really. I'm not most divorced fathers." I said, then because it was true, and it seemed like the right moment to say it, "You're a remarkable person, Renata. You just weren't right for me, and I wasn't right for you. That doesn't make either of us wrong." She nodded slowly. The elevator arrived. "Tell Broderick I wish him luck," I said. I didn't mean it exactly, but it was the correct thing. "I'll tell him you said hello," she said, which was wiser. I stepped into the elevator. Opal caught me in the lobby. She'd slipped away from the reception and was waiting by the entrance, shoes in her hand, stockinged feet on the marble floor. "I'll ride with you," she said. We got into a cab together. Opal put her shoes back on and sat curled against the window, watching the lights. "Larry's doing damage control," she said. "I saw him talking to the bank president, and the president's face was a specific kind of face." "I'll deal with the bank transfer on Monday," I said, "and everything will be fine." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Were you angry tonight?" I thought about it. Not the way I might have expected. I felt something when he was talking, but I don't think it was anger. I think it was clarity. "Clarity," she repeated. He was so sure of his version of things that I was the cautionary tale, the man who'd prioritize his ego over his family's well-being, the artistic indulgence that thankfully my ex-wife had been smart enough to leave behind. And he'd built that whole picture without ever asking a question or checking a fact, just certainty. I looked out the window. I've met a lot of people like that. They're not bad people, necessarily. They just stop seeing what's actually in front of them. Opal was quiet for a moment. "Mom kept your first film award. The one from the year after the divorce. It's in her desk drawer, and she closes it fast if she thinks anyone's looking." I hadn't known that. "People are complicated," I said, which is what you say when the right thing is true, but too layered to explain quickly. "She told me to talk to you about the law school thing," Opal said. "About deferring." "I know, she called me last week." Opal looked at me. "She called you?" "She said she thought I'd understand better than she did. What it means to choose something uncertain over something safe." Opal processed this. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you know," I said. "You already made the decision. You're just looking for permission." "From you?" "From yourself," I said. "I can tell you that deferring law school to spend a year doing the work you're genuinely good at is a reasonable thing to do. I can tell you that the creative industries are hard and require sustained commitment, and that there's no guarantee. I can also tell you that you have real instincts, Opal. I watched you in the studio this summer, and you have an ear for what a scene needs that takes most people years to develop, if they develop it at all." I paused. "But none of that matters if you don't actually want it. Do you want it?" She looked out the window for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "I really do." "Then that's your answer." She leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment, which she hadn't done since she was about 12. We rode the rest of the way in comfortable quiet. I went upstairs to my studio after dropping Opal at her subway stop. The city was loud below and quiet from up here, the way cities are when you're high enough. I sat at the piano and found a melody I hadn't played in years. The first real composition I'd written after moving into the Brooklyn apartment after the divorce. At the time, it had started as something heavy and formless, more feeling than music. I'd worked on it for weeks, and it had gradually become something else, something that moved forward instead of circling. I played it through twice, made a few small changes I'd been considering for a long time, and recorded a rough version. Then I made tea and looked out the window for a while. Fitz texted. The bank president left the reception early. Larry is currently very popular with no one. I texted back, let me know if Renata needs anything. Fitz replied, she's running the room like nothing happened. She's going to be okay. I believed him. 3 months later, in the middle of a deep winter snowfall that had made Manhattan briefly, improbably quiet, my phone rang. Renata's name on the screen, I answered. Everything okay? Yes, she said. Then, Larry and I are taking some time apart. I'm sorry, I said. Are you? Yes, I said. And I meant it, which is one of those things that surprises you about yourself. I never wanted your life to be difficult. She was quiet for a moment. He wanted a partner who would be the background to his ambitions, a supportive surface for his narrative. A pause. I've spent my career being the person at the center of complicated situations. I'm not very good at being decorative. No, I agreed. You never were. I called because the bank is hosting its annual Arts Endowment dinner in February, she said. We want a keynote speaker. The theme is unconventional paths to success. Another pause. I thought of you. The irony was so complete that I almost laughed. Your idea? My idea. What does the board think? They don't get a vote on keynote speakers, she said. I'm CFO. I'll do it. You haven't asked about the fee. Consider it a favor between people who share a daughter and a couple of decades of history. She was quiet for a moment. Are we friends, Callum? I don't know exactly what we are, I said. But we're something. Something functional and honest, mostly. That seems like more than a lot of people manage. It does, she said. How's Opal? I asked. She deferred law school. Renata said it without recrimination. She sent me a recording she made at your studio. The layering in it, she knows what she's doing. She really does. She gets the ear from you. She gets the discipline from you, I said. Renata made a sound that might have been a laugh. I told her I'd help her navigate the financial side of freelancing. She seemed surprised I offered. She shouldn't be. After we hung up, I sat at the piano for a while, without playing anything, just thinking about the shape of things. How the night of the wedding, I hadn't gone looking for vindication. I'd gone because Fitz asked me to, and because Opal was a bridesmaid, and because some part of me needed to stand in the same room as the decision I'd made 20 years ago and see it clearly. What I'd found instead was something more useful than vindication, a kind of settled clarity. Broderick's certainty about who I was had collapsed on contact with the truth, and what replaced it wasn't triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of being accurately seen, even if the seeing came late. I thought about the guy outside the cafe, the one on the phone, practically vibrating with the novelty of having been understood by someone new. Single tune, authentic vibes only. Filter out the noise. I still wasn't sure exactly what the app did or how it worked, but I understood what he'd been describing. The exhaustion of being fundamentally misread by someone you're trying to build a life with. The relief when the noise falls away and something true comes through. Renata and I had generated a lot of noise. We'd called it compatibility for a few years, and then called it irreconcilable differences, and then called it various things over the following 2 decades, as we found our way eventually to something honest and workable. But the core mismatch had always been there. We'd just been too young and too invested in a particular version of the future to hear it. Opal heard it clearly somehow. I'd watched her navigate her own sense of what mattered with a directness that I wasn't sure I'd had at her age. She hadn't tried to be what Broderick thought she should be or what the law school path suggested she should want. She'd named what she actually cared about and moved toward it. I was proud of her in a way I didn't have adequate words for. I picked out a few notes on the piano, added a few more. Something began to take shape that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. The particular sensation of a new piece finding its form, which always felt slightly like receiving something rather than inventing it. I grabbed a notebook and started writing things down. The keynote went well, as it turned out. I spoke about the difference between security and stability. How security is what you accumulate around yourself, and stability is what you build inside yourself. About how the most reliable thing I'd ever found was not a financial cushion or prestigious credit, but the knowledge that I knew what I was for. I talked about Opal without embarrassing her, told enough of the story to make the point without performing the private parts. The audience was full of bankers and donors and a few younger arts professionals who watched me with the specific attention of people who are wondering if what I'm saying applies to them. Renata introduced me. She said, flatly and clearly, that I was one of the most successful film composers working today, that I'd won an Academy Award, and that I was also Opal's father. Then she said that those two facts together told you everything you needed to know about what she'd chosen me to talk about. It was the most honest thing she'd said about my career in 20 years. Afterward, over refreshments, Fitz found me. You know, he said, she's been like this since the wedding. More direct, like something shook loose. Broderick happened to her, I said, or maybe she happened to herself and used him as the occasion. That's a very gracious read. I've got distance, I said. Distance helps. Renata came over later in the evening, not with anything particular to say, just to stand next to me for a moment while we both looked at the room. Good speech, she said. Good introduction. I've owed you that for a while. She held her wine glass and looked at the crowd. I told people for years that you taught music lessons, not because I thought it was true, because it was easier. I know. I'm sorry for that. I know that too, I said. Thank you for saying it. We stood there a moment longer, two people who had been a great many things to each other over the years and had arrived finally at something that worked. Opal's recording session is next month, Renata said eventually. I know, I'm producing it. She sent me the rough tracks. A pause. Sounds like you a little. The way themes reappear in a different key. She's her own thing, I said. She just inherited some of the vocabulary. She did, Renata said. And she sounded proud in a way that was genuine and uncomplicated, which maybe was growth, or maybe was just what happens when enough time passes and the noise finally clears. Some nights I still sit at the piano and play the piece I wrote in Brooklyn in 2008. It sounds different to me every time, depending on what I'm bringing to it. Some nights it sounds like loss. Some nights it sounds like determination. Most nights now it sounds like a beginning, something that needed to happen before everything else could. The dropout became the keynote speaker. The struggling composer became the Academy Award winner. The ex-husband found a kind of peace while the new marriage unraveled. There's a version of that story where the point is vindication, where the moral is that patience pays off, and the people who doubted you eventually have to eat their words in front of 60 witnesses. But that's not quite the story I was living. What I actually found in the rooftop garden, in the hallway with Renata, in the taxi with Opal with her shoes off and her feet on the seat, was that staying true to what I knew had not been a gamble that paid off. It had been the only option I was actually capable of. I hadn't had a choice. Not really. I couldn't have become a different kind of man to satisfy a different idea of success. I tried to imagine it in the low years after the divorce, and the imagining always rang hollow. There was only ever one path that felt like mine. I just had to walk it long enough for it to become legible to other people. That's not revenge, it's not vindication, it's just what happens when you stop performing someone else's version of your life and start living the actual one. Opal calls it the long game. Fitz calls it stubbornness with good outcomes. Renata these days doesn't call it anything. She just asks me smart questions about the production company and makes sharp observations about the music business and occasionally sends me an article about something I might find interesting. Whatever we are, it works. Something, I told her. We're something, that's enough. More than enough, actually. Most people spend their whole lives trying to get somewhere close to enough. I'm already here.